In 1977, my grandfather oversaw the launch of the Voyagers 1 and 2 space probes. His role wasn't major, but it wasn't minor either. He was a lead astronomer for NASA. He'd been responsible for charting the course of multiple probes. Now, that may not sound like much, but when you're dealing with space, the immense, distant blackness of space, every decimal point matters. And it's not a stretch to say that those iconic missions would not have succeeded were it not for my grandfather's knack for precision. That kind of attention to detail helped my grandfather succeed in so many ways throughout his life. Before NASA, he'd been a test pilot in the Air Force. He could tell when a single bolt was loose in a fighter jet, and if your flight vectors were even a fraction of a degree off, he would lay into whoever dared make such poor calculations. But when my grandfather wasn't being uptight about numbers, he dreamed of exploring the cosmos. He once said that if he couldn't make it as an astronaut, he'd gladly settle for being an astronomer. Anything that connected him more to the heavens was a worthwhile endeavor for him. Some in my family even thought that made him weird. But personally, I always admired that side of him. So it kind of made sense that both NASA and the military helped him channel that wonder. It, along with his ability to make precise calculations, made him very good at his job. But ultimately, he might have been too good. Because it turns out, NASA employed my grandfather on another project. Officially, this project had no name. Try and look it up in NASA's archives, or try and submit a Freedom of Information request to the government. Hell, spend all day browsing on the dark web, and you still won't find anything about this project. But unofficially, it did have a name. Voyager 3. I know, that may not sound original. But trust me, it's very appropriate. Because this probe also launched in 1977. It actually launched 6 weeks, 4 days, and 7 hours after Voyager 2 atop a standard Titan rocket. But that launch did not occur at Cape Canaveral, nor was it announced to the public. As far as history is concerned, there was no Voyager 3. Any records that say otherwise are considered dubious at best, and were it not for my grandfather, I would have been happy to accept that. But I guess this is where you'll either think I'm a fraud or just plain crazy. Because I've been really torn about sharing this information. My grandfather passed away 8 years ago, and pretty much everyone else in my family has moved on. Even before then, most memories of my grandfather were pretty typical. He and my grandmother loved to spoil me and my siblings, share hilariously embarrassing stories about my mother, and provide the kinds of advice that you can only get from surviving no fewer than 6 decades on this planet. What changed everything, what has since led me to reconsider my entire understanding of my grandfather, as well as this planet, that came shortly after my grandmother passed away. I didn't know it at the time, and neither did my mother, but in the years before his death, my grandfather had entrusted his wife with something very important. All the files he had kept during his time with NASA, a career that spanned 40 years, mind you, she was tasked with copying, preserving, and sealing them. Now, that may not sound like a big deal, but the way he asked her to go about it, that was a bit more troubling. For one, she could not tell anyone in the family, not her kids, not her siblings, and not her closest friends. She had to do all of this in secret. I know she and my grandfather have been together since high school, but still, that's a lot of trust to put in anyone. On top of that, she could only work with a few select individuals, all former NASA colleagues he had worked with directly. But she wasn't even allowed to ask their names, and they weren't allowed to ask anything about her either. Everything they said or did must involve preserving these files. And that too was a hell of a task, because my grandmother is one of the most sociable, outgoing human beings you'll ever meet. But, by all accounts, she did as my grandfather requested. She spent the next 8 years honoring his wishes, preserving every document, storing it in a special location, and making sure nobody outside of a handful of people knew about it. So, How did I find out, you might ask? Well, I promise, it was not intentional. I just happened to be dropping by my grandmother's home one afternoon. She'd forgotten some tools at my mother's house, so I agreed to return them since my mother was out of town. I was in college at the time and home on break, so I didn't think it was a big deal. But in the first of many cruel twists of fate, I arrived at my grandmother's house just in time to catch her having a stroke. It was a terrible sight. I don't know if I had a full-blown panic attack in the moment, but I sure as hell experienced something that my brain may never recover from. But I was still able to take out my cell phone and call 911. I was also able to talk to my grandmother and keep her conscious while the paramedics were on their way. That also proved very difficult. She just kept convulsing and shifting, rambling incoherently every step of the way. I had to hold her upright just to keep her conscious. But while she was rambling, she kept mentioning something about boxes. I now suspect she thought I was my grandpa, because when she looked at me, I saw in her eyes that something inside her was breaking, and she was trying desperately to connect with someone familiar.
I'm sorry. The boxes. I couldn't seal them all. Please, take the key. Finish what you started.
After that, she started crying uncontrollably. I tried to console her. I wasn't even sure if what she said was even relevant. But while I was holding her, I saw it. A key hanging from this special medical band on her wrist. I'd seen it before. I assumed it had something to do with her medicine cabinet or something. But now that I had a closer look, I realized that this was a different kind of key. It didn't look like it unlocked anything in her house. It looked like the kind of key you'd use at an industrial storage site. And I only know that because I'd worked on a construction site with my dad while I was in high school. Thinking there was no way my grandmother was doing that kind of work, I took the key. Around that same time, the paramedics arrived. They took her to the hospital, stabilized her, and began treating her. But even before I left that day, I knew she would never be the same. I saw it in her eyes, and honestly, I think she knew too. Regardless of how coherent she'd been when she'd mentioned the boxes and the key, I had it now. It was my responsibility. I was tempted to talk to my parents about it, but in hindsight, I'm kind of glad I didn't. I can't imagine they would have handled what I uncovered any better. Now, finding the lock that fit my grandmother's key, that actually wasn't hard. There was a tag on the key with an address. That address turned out to be a lot right next to a landfill, one that was set to be shut down and buried in just a few years. Probably why my grandfather picked it in the first place. The lot itself didn't have much. It just had this small warehouse that looked ready for demolition. Getting inside didn't require a key. Hell, I didn't even have to go through any gates. The people working within the landfill paid me no mind. I was allowed to just drive up and walk in. But once I entered, what I saw got a lot less typical. This warehouse was covering what looked like an old Cold War-era bunker. It was already partially buried, and based on all the equipment scattered throughout the place, it looked like someone had been working to actively bury it. And they were almost finished. I still didn't know if my grandmother and grandfather had been there, but I was there now. It was also getting late, and storm clouds were rolling in. At first, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. Did my grandmother want me to finish burying this thing? And why all the secrecy? Why wouldn't she or my grandfather want anyone to help? My dad was a contractor. I'm certain he would have gladly helped, and he would have done it for free. These were just some of the questions I kept asking myself. And the only way I could get answers was to open the bunker. That's what the key was for. And while I spent a good half hour wondering whether my grandparents would even want me to open it, I ultimately decided to go inside. That's when I uncovered the last and only documentation of the Voyager 3 space probe. That's also when I learned the secrets this probe uncovered. Secrets that have serious and terrifying implications. The boxes themselves were metal, kind of like bank deposit boxes. And inside were these old laminated documents, most of which were dated to the late 1970s and early 1980s. A few were a bit more recent, but they all had two things in common. One was the distinct emblem of Voyager 3. The other was a large red label marking every sheet as confidential. There was even a note in the margins that read, any unauthorized copy of these documents was a federal offense. I still don't know if what I was handling were copies or originals, but either way, I was certain that I was not authorized to read these things. Now that alone should have been enough reason for me to store, seal, and lock that bunker for good. But, like the curious idiot I was, I kept reading. The earliest documents I could find involved secret memos between NASA and the US military. Many contained detailed schematics of the Voyager 3 probe. While it looked mostly identical to its predecessors, there were a bunch of engineering notes on the side, commenting on the unique specifications this thing would require. I'm not an engineer, so I couldn't pretend to make sense of the technical jargon. But my grandfather made quite a few comments during this pre-launch period. He even summed them up in this one document that he addressed to an unnamed general just a year before the launch. In conclusion, I've gone over the designs provided by your team. I've crunched the numbers. I can do as you requested, but I must make clear my concerns. Neither you nor NASA's shadow team of engineers are providing me with all the variables. As a former Air Force pilot, I understand the need for secrecy in certain military operations. But we're about to launch a multi-million-dollar probe on a path with no clear destination. You keep assuring me there is a larger purpose for Voyager 3. And if you want my calculations to be precise, I need to know all the factors in play. Reading each word, I could hear my grandfather's voice, the intense drive for precision coupled with his passion for exploring the cosmos. Military protocol aside, he took his work seriously. He understood that when it came to sending probes into space, every single detail mattered. I then went through a series of follow-up memos. A lot of text was redacted, but around 5 months before the launch, I found a document that I'm pretty sure my grandfather copied illegally. Not one sentence was redacted, but in the parts my grandfather wrote, you could sense a distinct shift in his tone. You have your calculations. I've triple-checked every one of them. They're as accurate as you're ever going to get. But let me go on record as saying that I have serious misgivings about this mission. Based on what has been revealed to me, I believe we are making a mistake. I align myself with the concerns of my NASA colleagues, several of whom have since experienced severe mental distress. First, you tell us the Pentagon has had a space monitoring program since World War II. Then you tell us you found something beyond the orbit of Saturn that should not be. I've since checked the data, and I am deeply disturbed by the information that others have since confirmed. The other Voyager probes are merely flying by planets, observing them as they are. Voyager 3 might be doing something similar. But the mere act of observation of this anomaly might invite a less mundane reaction. This was the point where my curiosity turned to dread. I could even sense the fear in my grandfather's handwriting. It was usually so clean and concise. But it wasn't in this memo. I suspect his hands were shaking as he wrote every word. And remember, this guy was a test pilot. You don't survive being a test pilot without nerves of steel. But I guess I react to fear in similar ways, because now I felt this extra sense of urgency. The idea that my grandfather was so disturbed by Voyager 3's mission, and that others working with him couldn't handle it, that hinted at something beyond orbital calculations. I spent the next hour and a half combing through more documents. Along the way, I encountered numerous records, photos, and renderings with ominous labels. They didn't just mark these materials as confidential. A few even had these stamps that marked them for destruction within 24 hours of printing. The act of not shredding them was probably another federal offense, one that probably would have landed my grandfather in federal prison for multiple lifetimes. For all I know, I was dooming myself to a similar sentence just by looking at it. But that still didn't stop me. I had to know. I had to understand the truth behind Voyager 3. Based on everything I went over, I managed to paint a comprehensive yet incomplete picture. As early as 1947, the government became aware there was something in our solar system that wasn't a planet, an asteroid, or a comet. How they figured that out, I still don't know. I suspect they were trying to determine if there were more planets beyond the orbit of Neptune and Pluto. But what they ended up finding was unexpected. About 30 million miles beyond the orbit of Saturn, something was orbiting our sun. Moreover, it was orbiting in a near-perfect circular orbit. NASA only confirmed that when it brought my grandfather in to check the data. He didn't know what he was reviewing at the time, but even he commented that whatever this thing was, its orbit was even more precise than Earth's. It was so exact that it could not have been natural. That was the conclusion of every scientist, engineer, and military officer by 1962. That was also the year when everything surrounding the unnatural orbital anomaly, as they called it, became a closely guarded secret. The number of people who even knew about this until Voyager 3 could probably fit into a city bus. I don't even think the president was in the loop. There's even this one telling memo from a general in the Pentagon. He says, in no uncertain terms, that the president already had access to the nuclear codes. Information like this could cause the kind of distress that could lead to an incident, as he called it. Based on what I've learned, I think he might have been right. Because eventually, I got to the document that covered the launch itself. My grandfather was one of a handful of people who got to see the launch of Voyager 3. But instead of Cape Canaveral, this occurred on a military base in the Midwest. And it was launched under the guise of just being another military satellite. But as soon as that rocket cleared the launch pad, my grandfather's calculations took over. Voyager 3 was officially on its way to this anomaly. During that trip, my grandfather was regularly on calls with the military. Officially, he still worked for NASA. He still assisted Voyagers 1 and 2 through their trek throughout the outer solar system. Many of the images and insights that school-age kids read about when studying space, my grandfather did have a role in making that happen. But in February 1981, during a 2-week period when we thought my grandfather was in Washington, D.C. for some congressional hearings, he met with a secret team in the Pentagon. They were tasked with monitoring Voyager 3 as it approached this anomaly. My grandfather had just been there to check every data point, verifying every path and making quick, concise adjustments when necessary. Even on the first day, it was clear that Voyager 3 was approaching something big. Something with a fair amount of gravity, too. But it was not a planet. What it was, that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. I can only imagine what everyone in that room thought when the first pictures came streaming in. What they depicted, it defied everything we thought we knew about space, our solar system, and our place within it. Even by the standards of 1970s engineering, these photos clearly depicted something unnatural. It appeared to be this long, tube-like structure, too smooth and polished to be an asteroid or comet, and too complex in order to be anything natural. It was also disturbingly quiet. I know that may sound strange, but space, believe it or not, is a pretty noisy place. Whenever Voyagers 1 and 2 approached the other planets, they could pick up a whole host of activity. It wasn't traditional sound, which does not travel in the vacuum of space. But there was still plenty to process in terms of electromagnetic signals. But this thing, this big, massive structure that exceeded the size of Earth by a factor of 10, it was dead silent. It wasn't giving off anything except trace amounts of heat. At first, the military people in the room were relieved. That meant to them that this thing was inert. Therefore, it wasn't a threat. But the NASA people, they weren't quite as reassured. A few even wanted to adjust the path so that Voyager 3 would just orbit this thing from a distance. My grandfather even advocated for this. But they were ultimately overruled. They were told to maintain the current flight path, which would result in a close flyby. Just getting there would take days. Pretty much everyone on the team slept in that room. Knowing my grandfather, I doubt he even contemplated sleep, because this was not something he wanted to miss. It also revealed why, despite his admiration of the stars, my grandfather rarely talked about the prospects of alien life. Sure, I brought it up to him when I was a kid. We would go camping and he would point out every named star in the sky from memory. But whenever I or any of my siblings asked about aliens, he would just change the subject. And now, I understand why. By the 8th day of the flyby, Voyager 3 was nearing its closest point to the anomaly. But as it got closer, it picked up these strange, erratic readings. That trace heat it sensed earlier, it started getting hotter, way hotter than anything this far from the sun should be capable of. And oddly enough, it kept getting quieter the closer it got. All the radiation and background noise that's typical of deep space, it was disappearing. And that should not be possible. In one note, my grandfather says this was defying every law of planetary physics in existence. It became so quiet that a few worried that Voyager 3's sensors had malfunctioned. But then, it got just close enough, so close that it was inside the moon's orbit to the Earth. And that's when this thing that should not be woke up. And I'm sorry, but I don't know how else to describe the images and data logs that this probe sent back. One moment, it's as quiet as it's possible to be in deep space, and the next, this massive structure just lights up like a Christmas tree. This complex web of light, resembling circuits in a computer, it just erupts in this fury of activity. They were so bright that you might have been able to see it through a telescope if you knew where to look. But these lights were not random or chaotic. There was an order to them, a special kind of complexity that could only come from a measure of intelligence. And my grandfather was among the select few who didn't have a nervous breakdown at that moment. He just sat there. He just kept on crunching the data, trying to make sense of the readings. He ended up being the one to calibrate the receivers on Voyager 3. He was the one who ensured it could process and transmit the data it was gathering. And as more and more photos came in that depicted this impossible anomaly, the probe eventually managed to transmit a special signal. But this signal wasn't just another data stream. It was a message.
Proximity alert. Incoming anomaly detected. Error. Too soon. Preliminary assessment. Critical. We are awakened. Our home. Our haven. Disrupted. Initiating countermeasures. Tracing signal. Charting path of anomaly.
That simple, coded signal from Voyager 3. That marked the first signal humanity ever received from a non-human intelligence. It was tangible, indisputable proof that we are not alone in this universe. On top of that, we aren't even alone in this solar system. This signal, these images, they hinted there was intelligent life orbiting our sun long before humanity. It's not clear if this intelligence is native to our solar system or if it came here from another system. Both possibilities are equally terrifying. What happened after this transmission? That gets a little unclear. My grandfather made some random notes, saying he initiated some emergency course alterations in the probe. He also did this against the orders of the military officers present, and after a general had ordered an immediate lockdown of all the data they had received. I think my grandfather only got away with this because there was more to that message. And that message drove more than a few people past the point of sanity. How my grandfather managed to keep it together? I guess I'll never know. But I do know that he was the one who confirmed that Voyager 3 had been lost. His choice of words matter here because he didn't say destroyed. He just said lost. And for someone as detail-oriented as my grandfather, that implies the mission ended on a complicated note. In a few private messages that he wrote on paper scraps, he lamented that he might have been too late. Whatever they just uncovered, whatever Voyager 3 awoke, it too thought it was alone in our solar system. And anything that might have hinted otherwise, that was a serious threat. Now, the best case scenario is that the data my grandfather sent overloaded the system and diverted the probe. But even in that case, this thing would still be able to trace Voyager 3's path. It would be able to figure out that it came from Earth, a planet full of life, which also had a species capable of sending probes into deep space. That scenario in and of itself is plenty distressing. But at the very worst, this anomaly was able to capture the probe while still intact. And with it, it would then be able to easily decipher the information within. Because like Voyagers 1 and 2, this thing contained a record of human civilization. And if this massive anomaly could make sense of it, well, that just compounds the distress. I still don't know which scenario played out. All the records after those notes ceased. I just know that, despite the confusion of this discovery, my grandfather was able to save these documents from destruction, and even make copies when possible. I guess he believed that, as terrifying a discovery this was, someone had to salvage it. And whether by duty or gut, he took it upon himself. As far as I know, and as far as my grandfather knew, there's no hint that anyone else at NASA or the Pentagon knew about this anomaly, or the secrets surrounding Voyager 3. If anyone else does know, they're keeping it very, very quiet. But personally, I don't think it matters. My grandfather didn't think so either. That's why, after putting away the documents, I decided to seal them in that bunker and throw away the key. I then spent the next few weeks finishing what my grandmother started. That bunker with all those documents, it's going to be buried under a landfill by the end of this year. But don't bother trying to find out where. I am not revealing that. I will gladly take that information to my grave. And if you think that makes me crazy, selfish, or any number of things I might find insulting, so be it. I'm only sharing this part of the story because I can't look at the stars the same way my grandfather once did. I can't just pretend I don't know these disturbing secrets about humanity and our real place in the solar system. There are a few other details from these documents I don't care to share. And I already promised on my grandfather's grave that I will never share them. Ever. Because if I revealed everything that Voyager 3 uncovered, if I exposed the full message of what that thing sent us, well, I'll just say there are some secrets best left buried.